Chapter 1. A Woman in Red and a Dead Theologian. There are three things Nero Wolfe will not tolerate before 11 in the morning: conversation, visitors, and what he calls the aggressive fragrance of concern. By that he means anyone who comes through the front door wearing urgency like a second coat. On the Tuesday in October when Margaret Fenwick arrived at the brownstone on West 35th Street, she was wearing all three, plus a red wool dress that probably cost more than my monthly salary. I had been at my desk in the office going through the morning mail, mostly bills, 2 requests for autographed photographs of Wolfe, which I always declined on his behalf, and a letter from a man in Albuquerque who claimed his neighbor was poisoning his roses and wanted to hire us, when the doorbell rang at 9:47. Fritz was in the kitchen doing something aromatic to a duck, so I answered it myself. The woman on the stoop was somewhere between 35 and 40, which is to say, she looked 32 and had the eyes of someone 10 years older. Dark hair, fine bones, a jaw that said she was used to getting what she wanted. The red dress was tasteful rather than flashy, which told me she had money enough not to need to advertise it. She was carrying a small black clutch and holding herself very still in the way people do when they are afraid that if they move, something will break. "Archie Goodwin?" she said. "The same. And you're?" "Margaret Fenwick. I called yesterday. I have a 10 o'clock appointment." I checked my watch, 15 minutes early. That either meant she was anxious, or she didn't trust traffic. Or both. I let her in. The front office smells like old wood, good leather, and the faint ghost of the orchids Wolfe keeps in the plant rooms on the roof. Wolfe maintains that the office is the most civilized room in New York, a claim I've never bothered to dispute, because arguing with Wolfe before noon is like arguing with a glacier. Technically possible, but you'll just end up cold and defeated. Fenwick to the red leather chair across from Wolfe's desk, offered coffee, which she declined, and went to the house phone to buzz the plant rooms. There was the customary 4-second pause, which is Wolfe's way of indicating that he's aware the universe continues to make demands on him, despite his preference that it not. Then his voice came through, deep and measured as a courthouse bell. "Yes, your 10 o'clock is here. Mrs. Margaret Fenwick. She looks like money and trouble, in that order. I will be down at 11. She's sitting in your chair right now." Another pause. "Then she may wait." He hung up. I turned to Mrs. Fenwick with my most reassuring smile, which Fritz says looks like a man who has just been told his dentist is running late. "Mr. Wolfe will be with you shortly," I said. "He keeps to a strict schedule. From 9 to 11, he's with his orchids." She looked at me with those old eyes and the young face. "People are dead," she said quietly. "Does he know that?" "He'll know everything you tell him, Mrs. Fenwick. That's rather the point." She settled back in the chair, not relaxing exactly, more like a spring that had decided to wait before uncoiling, and I went back to the morning mail. We sat in companionable silence for the better part of an hour. She didn't fidget. I respected that. At 11:02 the elevator hummed. Wolfe's custom-built cage, rated for 450 pounds, which is a specification that tells you something about the man. The doors opened, and Nero Wolfe came into the office. He is, in the most precise sense, a monument. 6 feet 2 inches tall, and carrying somewhere north of 1/7 of a ton. Dressed as always in a dark suit that had been cut by a tailor with both skill and philosophical resignation. His face is large. His eyes are dark and small and miss absolutely nothing. And his mouth has a default expression that suggests he has just been informed of a social inconvenience he finds personally offensive. He crossed to his desk, lowered himself into the reinforced chair that Theodore Horstman built for him 14 years ago, regarded Margaret Fenwick for approximately 3 seconds, and said, "Madam, you may proceed." She did not proceed immediately. She looked at him the way people sometimes do the first time, trying to reconcile the reputation with the reality. Then she opened her black clutch, removed a folded sheet of paper, and set it on the desk without unfolding it. "My father-in-law was Reverend Charles Fenwick," she said. You may have read about him. He was found dead 4 days ago in his study at the Fenwick Theological Foundation on East 68th Street. The police have ruled it a heart attack." Wolfe said nothing. He had picked up a letter opener and was examining it with the focused attention he gives to things he considers more interesting than the current conversation, which is one of his interrogation techniques. It works because it is infuriating. "He didn't have a heart condition," she said. "Many people die of cardiac arrest without a prior diagnosis," Wolfe said, without looking up. "It is, in fact, the leading cause of unexpected death." "Yes, but my father-in-law also had a document he called the Crimson Testament, his private record of 40 years of financial arrangements, donations, bequests, and, as he once described it to me, indiscretions, committed by some of the most prominent families in this city. 3 days before he died, he told me it had gone missing from his safe." The letter opener came to rest on the desk blotter. Wolfe looked at her. "And you believe," he said, "that whoever took the document subsequently ensured he could not name them as the thief?" "I believe my father-in-law was murdered," she said, "and that whoever killed him now holds 40 years of secrets belonging to people who would pay almost anything to keep them secret." Yes. There was a silence. Outside, a taxi horn went off on 35th Street and faded. Wolfe folded his hands on his stomach, which is a gesture I've learned to recognize as the outward sign of an inward decision. "Your husband," he said. "Where is he in all of this?" She hesitated. It was the first hesitation she'd shown, and it was informative. "My husband, Daniel Fenwick, is the Foundation's executive director. He and his father had a complicated relationship." "Most relationships with complicated men are complicated," Wolfe said. "Who else had access to the Foundation building and knew of the document's existence?" "That's what I need you to find out." "On the contrary," Wolfe said, "that is what you will tell me. I do not investigate Mrs. Fenwick. I think. To think effectively, I require information. You will provide it now, as completely as you are able, and without the editorial omissions that clients invariably attempt." He raised his eyes to her. "I charge substantial fees. What you will receive in return is the truth, which I find most clients discover they wanted less than they expected." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she opened the folded paper and began to talk. By the time she finished, it was nearly 1 o'clock, and Fritz had appeared twice in the doorway to communicate, with escalating urgency through eyebrow semaphore, that lunch was ready. Wolfe had sat through Mrs. Fenwick's account without interruption, which meant he found it genuinely interesting, which meant the case was going to be complicated. The picture she painted was this: the Reverend Charles Fenwick, 71, founder and patriarch of the Fenwick Theological Foundation, a charitable organization that had, over 4 decades, funneled millions into seminaries, mission work, scholarly publications, and the occasional political campaign, had been found dead at his desk by his personal assistant, a man named Raymond Cross, at 8:15 last Friday morning. The official cause was cardiac arrest. There were no signs of disturbance in the room. His afternoon tea service, prepared by Cross as was daily custom, was half consumed. There was no note, no evidence of an intruder, and the police had closed the matter within 48 hours. 3 days before his death, Charles Fenwick had told Margaret, his daughter-in-law, notably not his son Daniel, that a locked strongbox in his private safe had been removed. The strongbox contained what he called the Crimson Testament, a leather-bound journal, red-covered, in which he had recorded over 4 decades the details of financial transactions, personal confessions, and what she delicately described as arrangements involving the Foundation's major donors, board members, and certain public figures. He had kept it, he told her, as insurance, the kind of insurance that becomes a motive. There were, by Margaret's account, 4 people who had known about the document's existence: herself, her husband Daniel, Cross the assistant, and a woman named Sylvia Trent, the Foundation's chief development officer, who had apparently been Charles Fenwick's confidant for the last decade. "And which of them," I asked, after Mrs. Fenwick had left with a retainer receipt and an instruction to return the following evening with all 4 of the named individuals. "Do you like for it?" Wolfe had already moved to the dining room and was regarding his shad roe with concentrated benevolence. "I have no preferences at this stage, Archie. I have questions." Why did the old man tell her and not his son? I thought about that while I poured the beer. It was a good question. It had the shape of an answer somewhere inside it, but I couldn't find the opening yet. That I've learned over many years is the difference between Wolfe and me. I notice the lock. He sees the key. Also, he added, lifting his fork, who prepares tea for a man every afternoon for years? And why, on the day of his death, was only half of it consumed? Outside, October was doing its civic duty, turning the city the color of old copper. Inside, the shad roe was excellent, and the Reverend Charles Fenwick was dead, and somewhere in this city, someone was holding a red leather book full of other people's sins. It was, I thought, going to be an interesting week. Chapter 2, The 4 Who Knew. The following evening brought autumn rain, and 4 people who each, in their own distinctive way, did not want to be in the same room as the other 3. I had spent the day doing what Wolfe calls spade work, which is his elegant way of describing the less elegant work of running down backgrounds, making phone calls, visiting buildings, and talking to people who don't know they're being interviewed. I'd done a walk-through of the Fenwick Theological Foundation at East 68th, a solid limestone building that managed to look both pious and expensive, which is quite a trick. Spoken briefly to the building's day manager, a retired sergeant named Kowalski, who missed nothing and volunteered less, and polled what public records existed on the Foundation's financials, board structure, and recent personnel changes. What I found was a picture of an organization in quiet tension. The Foundation had been Charles Fenwick's creation, and by all accounts, his kingdom. His son Daniel had been executive director for 6 years, but the title had apparently not come with the authority. The old man had kept his hand on every significant financial decision until the week he died. 3 months ago, a board member named Harrison Cole, one of the Foundation's largest donors, had quietly resigned. 2 months ago, Cross, the assistant, had been given a significant pay raise, despite being, by the day manager's carefully neutral assessment, not particularly indispensable. And 6 weeks ago, Sylvia Trent had filed, then withdrawn, a formal HR complaint, against whom the day manager didn't know, or wouldn't say. I had all of this in my notebook when the 4 of them arrived that evening, within 15 minutes of each other, which told me either they'd coordinated or they all had the same level of anxiety about punctuality. Wolfe held court from behind his desk. I sat to the side, with my notebook and my best poker face, which people consistently underestimate. Fritz had put out beer and a plate of those small cheese things that Wolfe tolerates when he wants people to feel comfortable enough to talk carelessly. Daniel Fenwick came in first and established himself at the near end of the couch with the posture of a man on a board he chairs. He was 50, lean in the athletic way that requires maintenance, with a gray at the temples that was either distinguished or anxious, depending on the light. His handshake was the firm, 2-second variety that men learn in business school. Raymond Cross arrived next. He was in his mid-40s, slight, precise in his movements, wearing a suit that fit too well for a personal assistant's salary, unless, of course, there'd been a recent raise. He sat at the far end of the couch from Daniel Fenwick and did not look at him. That was information. Sylvia Trent arrived third. She was perhaps 55, with silver hair cropped close, and the bearing of someone who had spent decades in rooms full of people with more money and less sense than herself. She took the chair nearest the door, not nervously, but strategically, and crossed her ankles with the ease of a woman who has sat in better chairs than this. She looked at Wolfe with frank professional assessment, and apparently decided to reserve judgment. Margaret Fenwick came last, 5 minutes after the others, and the change in the room when she entered was subtle but measurable. Daniel Fenwick's jaw tightened by approximately 2 millimeters. Trent's eyes moved to Margaret and stayed there with an expression I couldn't immediately classify. Wolfe let the silence stretch just long enough to establish that he was the one choosing to break it. "Thank you for coming," he said, which was technically a lie. None of them had been given a meaningful choice, but was delivered with such authority that it sounded like a courtesy. "I will not waste your time with procedural pleasantries. You are here because one of you almost certainly murdered Reverend Charles Fenwick and stole a document from his safe, and I intend to determine which one." That landed the way Wolfe intends such statements to land, like a dropped anchor. Daniel Fenwick opened his mouth. Wolfe raised one finger without looking at him. "You will each have ample opportunity to speak. At present, I am speaking." He paused. "I will observe some things and ask some questions. Your answers will be less important than your hesitations. Begin, please, by telling me about the last week of the Reverend's life. Not the formal account you have rehearsed for the police, the true one. Mr. Cross, you were with him daily. You may start." Cross looked up from his shoes. He had very steady eyes, the kind that are either honest or very good at pretending. The Reverend was preoccupied, more than usual. He canceled 3 external meetings, which was unlike him. He spent long hours in his private study. He asked me twice to check whether the building's side entrance had been properly secured. "He was worried about someone entering," Wolfe said. "He was worried about something. He didn't specify what." "Did he receive any unusual visitors that week?" Cross hesitated, and there it was. The hesitation Wolfe had promised mattered more than the answers. "1. A man named Victor Ashe. He came on Wednesday, unannounced. They were together for about 40 minutes. When Mr. Ashe left, the Reverend was—" He stopped. "Finish the sentence, Mr. Cross," Wolfe said gently. Cross, shaken. "Who is Victor Ashe?" Wolfe asked the room. The silence that followed was itself an answer of a kind. Sylvia Trent spoke first, which told me she'd made a calculation about the cost of not speaking. "Victor Ashe was a former board member," she said. "He and the Reverend had a falling out approximately 2 years ago over foundation funds. He resigned under pressure." "Under what pressure specifically?" Trent's expression remained composed. "I'm not certain of the details." "That," Wolfe said pleasantly, "is almost certainly untrue. But I will return to it." He turned his gaze to Daniel Fenwick. "You were your father's executive director for 6 years. Would you describe your working relationship as harmonious?" Daniel Fenwick had the kind of face that practices control in the mirror each morning. "We had differences of opinion about management style. That's normal in any organization. He overruled your decisions regularly, I'm told." "Occasionally." "You had proposed 4 months ago that the Foundation's endowment investment strategy be restructured. He refused." A pause. "Yes. You had also proposed that the donor acknowledgement process be centralized under your office, removing it from direct oversight of the Reverend's private office. That was an administrative recommendation." "He refused that as well." "Yes." "And the Crimson Testament," Wolfe said. "When did you learn of its existence?" And there it was, the cleaner hesitation, the one with a different texture than discomfort. Daniel Fenwick's 2-millimeter jaw adjustment returned. My father mentioned it once. Years ago. I didn't take it particularly seriously. I wrote in my notebook. He knew. Question is, when he found out it was gone." "Mrs. Fenwick," Wolfe said, shifting to Margaret, "you told me your father-in-law informed you of the document's disappearance 3 days before his death. Why you, and not your husband?" Margaret had been sitting with a stillness I'd noticed the previous morning. Now she looked directly at her husband for the first time since entering the room, and then back at Wolfe. "Because," she said, "he didn't trust Daniel." The temperature in the room changed. It was only a couple of degrees, but it was measurable. Daniel Fenwick said, very quietly, "Margaret." He asked me, she continued, addressing Wolfe as though Daniel had not spoken. He asked me to be careful. He said that if anything happened to him before the document was found, I should not assume it was natural. He said those words explicitly. He said, "Margaret, I am an old man with a strong heart and a great many enemies. If I die before this is resolved, ask questions." There was a silence, in which I could hear the rain doing its work on the brownstones windows, and the faint sound of Fritz in the kitchen, which is one of the more comforting sounds in the world. Sylvia Trent uncrossed her ankles, and said in a measured tone, "This is all very dramatic, but the police examined Charles's death thoroughly." "The police," Wolfe said, "examined it adequately, which is not the same thing. There is a distinction between the absence of evidence of murder and the presence of evidence of natural death. The former was established. The latter was assumed." He looked at Cross. "The tea. You prepared it daily?" "Yes." "That afternoon, did you deviate from the usual preparation in any way?" Something moved across Cross's face, not guilt exactly, but awareness. The awareness of someone who has asked himself the same question. "No," he said. "Did anyone else have access to the tea service before you brought it in?" He stopped, reconsidered. "The tray was prepared in the small kitchen on the third floor. I was called away briefly to receive a delivery. When I returned, perhaps 5 or 6 minutes later, the tray was as I'd left it." "You had not locked the kitchen?" "There's no lock on that door." Wolfe leaned back in his chair. The room waited. This is one of his techniques, the pause that invites people to fill silence with things they hadn't planned to say. Nobody filled it. "Very well," he said at last. "You will all make yourselves available for individual conversation with Mr. Goodwin over the next 2 days. You will answer his questions with the same candor you would apply to mine, knowing that I will be informed of any discrepancy between tonight's accounts and tomorrow's. You may go." They went, not all at once, but in the careful sequence of people who each want to be last, and none of whom want to be seen wanting it. Trent left first, with a brisk nod. Cross followed. Margaret Fenwick stood, and Daniel Fenwick said her name again, and this time she stopped. "We should talk," he said. "We should have talked 3 months ago," she said, and left. He stood there for a moment, then followed. When the door closed, I turned to Wolfe. He had already reached for his beer. "Well," I said. "Indeed," he said. 5 or 6 minutes. That's enough time." "It is enough time for several things," Wolfe said. "The more interesting question is not whether someone had time, but which of them had occasion to know it was necessary." He finished the beer and set the glass down with a precision that suggested the evening's work was complete to his satisfaction, which meant it was just beginning to mine. Chapter 3. What the Tea Knew. The medical examiner's report on Reverend Charles Fenwick listed cause of death as acute myocardial infarction. Heart attack, plain and simple, the kind that takes a man in his chair at his desk between afternoon tea and supper. No toxicology screen had been ordered. Why would it be? A 71-year-old man, no prior cardiac history notwithstanding, found at his desk. The city processes 40, 50 such deaths a week. The examiner had been thorough within the boundaries of what he'd been given to look for, which is the central problem. You find what you look for, and nobody had looked for poison. That was the thought Wolfe planted in my head Thursday morning before ascending to his orchids. He didn't use the word poison. He said, "Archie, it would be instructive to know what compounds might produce, in a man of the Reverend's age and constitution, the appearance of cardiac arrest in a manner unlikely to survive a standard autopsy screen." Then he went upstairs, and I spent the next 2 hours on the phone with a contact at the state toxicology lab, a man I'll call Dr. Marsh, because he prefers it. Dr. Marsh was helpful in the way that experts are helpful when they find a question interesting. At length, and with enthusiasm. There are several candidates, he told me. Cardiac glycosides, for instance, digitalis compounds specifically. At sufficient dose in an elderly subject, particularly one who has perhaps consumed alcohol or taken standard blood pressure medication, digoxin toxicity can produce fatal arrhythmia, presenting precisely as myocardial infarction. It would not appear on standard post-mortem screening unless specifically requested. You'd need a focused immunoassay. Potassium chloride in high concentration can do similar work, and there are some plant alkaloids. The T angle, something introduced to a hot beverage. Digoxin certainly would survive brief heat exposure. So would a number of others. I thanked him and called Wolfe on the house phone. Digitalis, I said. Yes, he said. Among the more probable candidates. Mr. Goodwin, did the Foundation maintain a garden? I blinked. I don't know, I can find out. Please do. Foxglove, Digitalis purpurea, is commonly grown as an ornamental. It is also the source compound of digitalis preparation. A person with access to a garden and rudimentary knowledge could, with some effort, prepare a concentrated extraction. There are simpler pharmaceutical routes, of course, but those leave records. There was a pause, in which I thought about what kind of person does that kind of research, and concluded it could be more than one of the 4 people currently in my notebook. The Foundation, I confirmed within the hour via a phone call to the groundskeeper, maintained a small formal garden on the building's rear terrace. He told me, with the special pride of a man whose work is underappreciated, that it included several heritage plantings, including, yes, foxglove, several varieties in fact. The Reverend had apparently been fond of it. The irony was not lost on me. That afternoon, I did my individual interviews. Raymond Cross met me at a coffee shop on Madison he'd suggested, which told me he didn't want to talk in his apartment or at the Foundation, which told me something else. He was composed and precise, as he'd been the night before, but in the reduced setting of a corner booth, he seemed smaller, less architectural. He ordered black coffee and didn't touch it. I asked him about the tea, and his version held. Prepared in the third-floor kitchen, he was called away to receive a package delivery from a courier, returned to find the tray undisturbed, and brought it to the Reverend's study. The Reverend had taken the tray himself at the door, saying he didn't want to be disturbed. That was the last time Cross saw him alive. The package, I said. From whom? A legal courier, documents from the Foundation's attorneys, a routine filing update for the board. Convenient timing. He looked at me steadily. I thought so too, afterward. You didn't mention it to the police? They didn't ask. A pause. And I wasn't sure. I'm still not sure. About what? He turned the coffee cup in its saucer, once. About whether I was intended to be away from that kitchen for 5 minutes, or whether it was just coincidence. It is a peculiar kind of courage, I thought, to say that aloud. Either he was innocent and frightened, or he was the kind of guilty that plants its own misdirection early. Did you notice anything different about the tray when you returned? Anything disturbed? A spoon moved, a lid replaced at a different angle? No, but I wouldn't necessarily have noticed. Who knew the tea routine? Who knew when you made it? What time? Which kitchen? Everyone who worked in that building regularly, he said. It wasn't a secret. 4 o'clock tea in the third-floor kitchen, every day for 9 years. I wrote that down. Then, what was in the document Mr. Ash brought? The visitor on Wednesday. Cross looked up. I don't know. I wasn't in the room. But you saw the Reverend after? Yes. Describe it again. Shaken, you said. His hands were... Cross stopped. Started again. He came out of the study, and his hands were shaking slightly. Not dramatically. He was a controlled man. But I'd worked for him 9 years, and I knew his hands. Did he say anything? Cross hesitated. A real hesitation this time, not the calculated kind. He said, Raymond, I think I've made a terrible mistake. I asked what he meant. He said, never mind, it's being corrected. I let that sit for a moment. A terrible mistake. being corrected. That phrasing could mean he was trying to fix something, or it could mean he'd set something in motion that 3 days later got him killed. Sylvia Trent met me at the foundation itself, her choice, which was confident, and sat across from me in a small conference room, with the poise of someone who has given depositions and found them less troubling than advertised. She was dressed for a working day, efficient and precise, and she began before I'd fully opened my notebook. "I know you want to talk about Victor Ashe," she said. "Among other things," I replied. "Victor Ashe was a founding board member," she said. 12 years on the board, 3 as chair. 2.5 years ago, an internal audit, which I conducted, at the Reverend's direction, identified irregularities in a restricted grant fund. Approximately $230,000 in disbursements that didn't correspond to approved project allocations. They traced to decisions made under Ashe's authority during his time as chair. Embezzlement. Technically, misappropriation. The Reverend chose not to pursue criminal charges. Victor Ashe resigned quietly, made a private restitution arrangement, and disappeared from Foundation life. We assumed that was the end of it. But it was in the Crimson Testament. She paused. "I would assume so, yes. You knew about the testament. The Reverend mentioned it to me several years ago. He didn't show me its contents. He simply said he kept a record, and that the record was what ensured the Foundation's integrity was maintained by people who might otherwise be tempted." Her mouth formed a precise line. "He meant it as a safeguard, I think. Whether it remained one, or became something else, I can't say." "Did you know it had gone missing?" "Not until Mrs. Fenwick told me last night." "And the HR complaint," I said. "Filed and withdrawn 6 weeks ago." "Against whom?" The pause this time had dimensions. "That is a personnel matter. Mrs. Trent, a man is dead." She looked at me for a long moment. "Against Daniel Fenwick," she said. "He attempted to access the Reverend's private financial files, the ones maintained separately from the Foundation's official records, without authorization. I reported it. The Reverend asked me to withdraw the complaint and said he would handle it himself. Apparently, he didn't get the chance." I drove back to the brownstone in the early evening with that sitting in my gut like a stone. Daniel Fenwick, trying to access private files. Victor Ashe, visiting and shaking the old man 3 days before his death. The tea kitchen with its convenient 5-minute window. The Crimson Testament gone before the body was cold. I went to my desk and wrote it all out in longhand, the way I do when I need to see the shape of a thing. When I finished, I took it to Wolfe's office, where he was reading and had left strict instructions not to be disturbed. I disturbed him anyway. "Cross says the Reverend told him on Wednesday that he'd made a terrible mistake, and it was being corrected," I said. "Trent says Daniel Fenwick was caught trying to access private financial files 6 weeks ago, and the Foundation grows foxglove in the back garden." Wolfe set his book down. He was quiet for a moment. "A terrible mistake," he said. "Being corrected. The phrasing is ambiguous. It may mean he had made an error he was in the process of resolving, or someone else was doing the correcting," I finished. "Yes." He picked up his book. "Ask Mr. Goodwin." He stopped. "He sometimes forgets I'm Archie Goodwin. It's endearing, in a terrifying sort of way. Ask yourself, Archie, why a man who has maintained a dangerous document safely for 40 years would suddenly lose it in the same week he receives a disturbing visitor and begins checking his door locks." I asked myself. The answer didn't come quickly, but it came. "He didn't lose it," I said. "He moved it." Wolfe's expression did not change, but his eyes had that quality they get, like a door opening at the back of a large dark house. "That is one possibility," he said. "And if so, where it was moved becomes considerably more important than where it was taken from." He returned to his book. I went to bed with the feeling that the case had just shifted its weight, the way a building does in a high wind, moving just enough to tell you it's alive. Chapter 4. The Audience in the Office. Friday afternoon, Wolfe summoned them individually. This is a technique he uses when he wants to apply pressure without the social buffer of a group. No one to look at, no performance to maintain, just the desk and the man behind it, and the silence that does most of his work. He had me present at my desk in both capacities, recording secretary and, as he once put it, a useful reminder that I am always in the room. Raymond Cross came first. Wolfe was direct. "You told Mr. Goodwin that you were called away from the kitchen by a courier delivery," Wolfe said. "I have confirmed that a delivery was made to the Foundation at 4:17 that afternoon. The log entry is signed with your initials." Cross nodded. "The delivery company's records indicate the driver was 12 minutes late due to traffic. He arrived at 4:17. Your initials were signed at 4:18. Wolfe paused. "Your normal tea preparation begins at 4. At 4:17 you were signing for a package. The tea was prepared when?" A silence. "I started earlier that day, at 3:50. "Why?" "I had a 4 o'clock call I'd forgotten about. With the Foundation's printer, about the annual report. I moved the tea preparation up." "Did anyone know you'd moved it up?" He stopped. "I mentioned it to Sylvia. I passed her in the hallway and said I was running the tea early. I wrote, 'Trent knew the kitchen window. New information.'" "Mr. Cross," Wolfe said, "the Reverend's last words to you, a terrible mistake, being corrected. In retrospect, do you believe he was referring to Victor Ashe's visit?" Cross thought about it. Genuinely, I could tell. "I think yes. I think Ashe came to him with something. A threat maybe, or an accusation. And the Reverend felt he'd done something, made some decision, that had created the situation." "And what decision," Wolfe said quietly, "might an old man make that he would later call a terrible mistake?" Cross looked down at the desk surface. "He may have told someone about the testament, someone he shouldn't have." Wolfe let that hang in the air like smoke. Then he thanked Cross and sent him out. Sylvia Trent came in with her professional armor polished. Wolfe took it off in 3 minutes. "You knew the tea was being prepared early," he said. She didn't flinch. "Yes. Raymond told me in passing." "You were in the building at that time?" "I work in the building, Mr. Wolfe." "You had access to the third-floor kitchen, along with approximately 15 other members of staff. But you are among the 4 who knew about the testament. That reduces the relevant population considerably." He folded his hands. "Mrs. Trent, in your 11 years working closely with Charles Fenwick, did he ever confide in you about the testament's specific contents?" A pause, longer than professional composure should have required. "On one occasion, approximately 3 years ago, he was, I think, trying to demonstrate something about the nature of institutional trust." "What was on the page?" "Names, amounts, and dates." She smoothed a crease from her skirt that did not exist. "Prominent names, political contributions routed through Foundation accounts that would not withstand scrutiny. Ashe's arrangement was on it, but also others, people who are still prominent. People who might have significant motivation to recover the document." "Yes. And yet," Wolfe said, "the document was not removed by an outsider. The safe was opened cleanly. No damage, no sign of forced entry. Someone had the combination." Trent looked at him. "The Reverend, obviously. Daniel. Possibly Cross. Possibly you. I did not have the combination. Did you ask for it?" A beat of silence that was 1 beat too long. "Once, years ago," he declined. "But you knew where the safe was. You knew what was in it. And 3 days ago you learned the document had disappeared." "From Margaret, yes." "Which means," Wolfe said, "you had 3 days to reflect on what its disappearance implied, and to decide what, if anything, to do about it." She looked at him steadily. "I decided to tell you the truth, which is what I'm doing." Wolfe regarded her. "That is either wise or a very good simulation of it. For now, I will treat it as the former." She left. The afternoon light through the office windows had gone the color of old bronze. Daniel Fenwick came last. and he came in with the posture of a man who has prepared. He sat down, crossed his legs, and produced a measured, reasonable expression that told me he'd practiced it. Wolfe said nothing for a full 30 seconds. Daniel Fenwick's reasonable expression began to develop small cracks. "My father's private financial records," Wolfe said at last. "The ones you attempted to access 6 weeks ago, without authorization. Why?" "I was the executive director," Fenwick said. "I had a fiduciary responsibility. You were stopped by Sylvia Trent, and the matter was reported. Your father chose not to discipline you formally. Why?" We resolved it privately. He confronted you. We had a conversation." "Did he tell you, in that conversation, about the Crimson Testament?" Fenwick's leg uncrossed, just slightly. "He mentioned it, in passing." "He mentioned a 40-year record of institutional indiscretions, in passing," Wolfe said, with a dryness that could have stripped paint. "And this passing mention, did it include information about your own activities, or only those of others?" The silence that followed was the loudest thing that had happened in the office all day. Daniel Fenwick said carefully, "What are you suggesting?" "Nothing at present. I am asking. The testament by Mrs. Fenwick's account documented 40 years of arrangements involving Foundation donors and associates. You have been at the Foundation for 6 years. It would be surprising if those 6 years had generated no entries." "My father and I had disagreements." "Mr. Fenwick." Wolfe's voice didn't rise. It never does. It simply becomes more precise, the way a blade does when it's been properly sharpened. "You had your father's safe combination, or access to someone who did. You had motive, personal, professional, and possibly legal, to recover the document. And you were in the building the afternoon your father died. So were 50 other people. 50 other people did not file an unauthorized attempt to access private financial records 6 weeks before his death. Did you enter your father's study that afternoon?" "No." "Did you have contact with the tea tray at any point?" "No." "Where were you between 3:45 and 4:30? "In my office, on calls." "Can that be verified?" A hesitation. "My assistant can confirm. Most of it." "Most of it." I underlined that twice. "One more question," Wolfe said. "Your father told your wife that he did not trust you. You have sat across from me for the past 10 minutes demonstrating with some precision why a careful man might reach that conclusion. I will ask you plainly. Did you remove the Crimson Testament from your father's safe?" Daniel Fenwick looked at Wolfe. His reasonable expression was gone. What was underneath it was harder to read. Not quite guilt, not quite innocence. Something in between that I've seen before, on the faces of people who have done something wrong, but not the particular wrong they're being accused of. "No," he said. "Did you kill your father?" "No." Wolfe looked at him for a long moment. Then, "Thank you, Mr. Fenwick. You may go." When he was gone, I put my pen down and looked at Wolfe. "He's hiding something." "Obviously," Wolfe said. "The interesting question is whether what he's hiding is the murder, or merely the knowledge of who committed it." "Those are not," I said, "the same thing." "No," he agreed, "they are not." Chapter 5. Legwork and Loose Ends. Saturday morning I was out early, because the case had 3 loose threads, and I am the kind of man who pulls loose threads. The first was Victor Ashe. He was not difficult to find. A man who has resigned from prominent public life under private pressure tends to either vanish completely or compensate by becoming ostentatiously visible. Victor Ashe had done the latter. He now ran a small private wealth management firm in a glass and steel building on Park Avenue South, and he had given, since his quiet departure from the Foundation, several interviews to financial publications in which he positioned himself as a reformed idealist, the kind of man who has found peace. I didn't have an appointment, which is a disadvantage that my press of manner and what Wolfe calls my aggressively friendly face generally compensate for. His assistant, a young man with the expression of someone who has been told to handle me, tried to intercept me. I told him Mr. Ashe would want to speak with me regarding the Fenwick Foundation, and that the alternative was a formal interview conducted by a man who made his less pleasant. That worked. Ashe was a compact man in his early 60s, silver-haired and tanned, with the permanent look of someone who exercises competitively. He sat behind his desk and watched me settle into the chair across from it with the wariness of a man who has been ambushed before and learned to sit facing the door. He said the record existed to protect the institution and he would not compromise it. Ashe's jaw tightened. He was, in that respect, a genuinely principled man, which made him, in other respects, a genuinely difficult one. Did he tell you the record had gone missing? Ashe's expression shifted fractionally. Genuine surprise, I thought. No. He didn't mention it? He mentioned that someone had recently attempted to access his private files without authorization. He was angry about it. Did he say who? No, but he implied it was someone close to him. Ashe looked at the window. He said, Victor, the people who would most like to destroy what I've built are the ones I've spent my life trusting. He seemed genuinely shaken by that. I sat with that for a moment. It didn't close any doors, but it opened a window. The second thread was the Foundation's garden. Back at East 68th, Kowalski, the day manager, let me onto the rear terrace without enthusiasm. The garden was well maintained, late season, and going brown at the edges, with a formal layout that someone had cared about. The foxglove was easy to find. Tall stalks, the flower bells already dried and papery, clustered in a bed near the garden wall. Beautiful, if you weren't thinking about what they could do. I called Dr. Marsh again. If someone harvested foxglove leaves, dried and extracted them, how long would the process take? To produce a usable concentration, several days minimum, more likely a week or two for something reliable. So this isn't a spontaneous decision. No, Marsh said. This is premeditated. The third thread was the document itself. Wolfe's suggestion that the Reverend had moved the testament rather than lost it had been sitting with me. I went back to the building, and with Kowalski's wary permission, asked to see the Reverend's study. It was a handsome room. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a partner desk, a reading chair by the window, a small table where the tea tray presumably had rested. The safe was built into the wall, behind a hinged section of shelving, obvious once you knew where to look. Closed and locked. The police had photographed it. Cross had confirmed it was empty, the strongbox gone, when he'd opened it the morning after the death. I stood in the middle of the room and tried to think like a 71-year-old man who'd just been shaken by a visitor and was beginning to suspect his walls were closing in. If you suspected someone had your combination, or would soon have it, where would you move something irreplaceable? Not far, not out of the building, too conspicuous. Somewhere accessible to yourself. Somewhere that would survive the night if things went wrong. I looked at the bookshelves, hundreds of volumes, dense and ordered. Then I looked at the reading chair. It was an old club chair, leather, with a loose cushion on the seat. I lifted the cushion. Nothing. But the chair's base had a small brass latch on one side. A storage compartment. The kind some reading chairs have for papers and magazines. I opened it. Inside was a plain manila envelope, unsealed. Inside the envelope was a red leather journal. I stood there for a moment in the afternoon light of a dead man's study, holding 40 years of other people's sins, and I felt the particular weight of things that are both answers and new questions simultaneously. I called Wolfe on my cell. I found the testament, I said. A pause. Where? In his reading chair. He moved it himself before he died. And you're certain it's the correct document? The first page bore the inscription, in a precise elderly hand, In veritate fides, in truth, faith. Below it, dated 41 years ago, was the first entry. I'm certain, I said. Bring it directly here, Wolfe said. Touch as few pages as possible. I know how to handle evidence, Wolfe. You know how to handle evidence, he agreed, but you are also constitutionally curious, and the temptation to read 40 years of prominent New Yorkers' indiscretions will be substantial. He wasn't wrong. I'll manage, I said. See that you do. He paused. And Archie, this changes the character of the case considerably. Because whoever took the strong box from the safe got an empty box. Yes, and they don't know that yet. Another pause. Or perhaps they do, and they are looking. I put the envelope inside my coat, thanked Kowalski, and went out into the Saturday afternoon. Somewhere in this city, someone had committed a carefully premeditated murder to obtain a document that was now riding against my ribs on the crosstown bus. I rode with my hand inside my coat, and my eyes on the other passengers, none of whom looked like murderers, which in my experience means very little. Chapter 6. The Shape of a Theory. Wolfe did not look at the testament Saturday evening. He held it in his hands for approximately 40 seconds, turning it over once, and then placed it in the lower right drawer of his desk, which locks, and spent the remainder of the evening reading The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, which he returns to periodically in the way some people return to a familiar landscape. Sunday he spent with his orchids in the morning, ate Fritz's trout almondine at noon with the concentration it deserved, and then came into the office and sat for the better part of 3 hours, without moving, without the book, without the beer, without anything except whatever was happening behind those small dark eyes. I have seen this before. I know enough to leave him alone. At 4:15 he said, Archie. I set down the sports section. Here. 3 questions require answers before I'm ready to act. First, who had the combination to the Reverend's safe? Not who theoretically could have obtained it. Who actually had it? Cross, almost certainly. Daniel, probably. Possibly Trent. Find out with specificity. Second, the Reverend's physician. His name will be in the Foundation records. Contact him and determine whether the Reverend was prescribed at any point medications that would have interacted dangerously with digitalis, specifically anything affecting cardiac rhythm. I wrote it down. And the third? The annual report, the printing matter that Cross was called to handle on the afternoon of the murder. Find the name of the printer and confirm who placed that order for same-day delivery that required Cross's signature at that specific time. I looked up from my notebook. You think the delivery was staged? I think it is worth knowing, Wolfe said. A 5-minute window in an unlocked kitchen is not a stroke of luck, if you arranged for the 5-minute window. I spent Sunday evening on those 3 questions. By 9 o'clock, I had partial answers. The safe combination. Cross confirmed he had it, given to him by the Reverend 2 years ago for emergency access. Daniel Fenwick had been given it, according to Foundation records, when he became executive director, then had his access revoked, also according to Foundation records, 8 months ago. Trent had never had it. Margaret Fenwick had never had it. So Cross could have opened the safe. Daniel Fenwick had once been able to, but, by the official record, no longer. The physician was a Dr. Bernard Hale, general practitioner, Upper East Side. I called his after-hours line and left a message flagged urgent. He called back at 10. The Reverend had been in fact taking a low-dose beta-blocker, atenolol, for mild hypertension. Dr. Hale confirmed that digitalis toxicity in a patient on atenolol would be substantially more severe and faster acting than in an untreated patient. The beta blocker would mask some of the warning symptoms and accelerate the cardiac effects. Someone who knew about that medication had a significantly more reliable method. The printer. The Foundation used a commercial printer in the garment district for all publications. I called Monday morning when they opened, ahead of Wolfe's time, but this warranted it. Their records showed the delivery had been scheduled in advance, 3 days prior to the date of death. Scheduled by email, from a Foundation account. The records showed the account name, R. Cross. I sat with that for a moment. Then I called Wolfe on the house phone. The print delivery was scheduled from Cross's own account, I said. From his account, Wolfe said. Or by him. That distinction, I realized, was the one that mattered. His account could have been accessed by someone else, I said. It could, Wolfe said. It also could have been him. We should not prematurely narrow. You think Cross is involved? I think Cross scheduled a delivery that created a 5-minute opportunity, or someone used his account to do so. I think Cross knew the tea was prepared early that afternoon and told at least one other person. I think Cross was positioned perfectly to either commit this act or to be perfectly framed for it. Which of those is true is what I do not yet know. I poured myself coffee and thought about it. The combination, I said. Daniel Fenwick's access was officially revoked 8 months ago, but official revocations only work if the combination was actually changed. Indeed. Was it changed? That, Wolfe said, is a question to put to Cross. I put it to Cross by phone. He was quiet for a moment. Then, the Reverend told me he'd changed it, after Mr. Fenwick's access was revoked. But, I don't know for certain that he did. If he didn't, Daniel could still have opened that safe. Yes, Cross said, he could have. I brought all of this to Wolfe at 11:30, spread my notes on the desk, and stood back while he read through them. He read slowly, in the way he does when he's not reading for information, but for pattern. The way you look at a painting rather than a diagram. When he finished, he folded his hands. The case, he said, has a shape now. Tell me. The Reverend was killed to prevent him from identifying whoever stole the testament, or intended to steal it. The theft was planned in advance. The delivery was arranged to create the kitchen window. The specific choice of agent, digitalis, derived from a garden available to Foundation staff, suggests the perpetrator had knowledge of the garden, the preparation process, and the Reverend's cardiac medication. The empty strongbox was a significant complication for the murderer, because it means the theft was incomplete. The document survived. And the killer? Someone who knew 4 things: the tea preparation time and location, the kitchen would be unattended, the medication the Reverend was taking, and where the foxglove grew. He paused. And who had sufficient access to Cross's email account to schedule the delivery, or who asked Cross to schedule it under some pretext? I looked at my notes. That's either Cross himself, or someone Cross trusts enough to have shared his computer. Or someone who shares a workspace with Cross and could access his terminal when he stepped away. Wolfe's eyes found mine. One more thing. The Reverend told Cross he'd made a terrible mistake that was being corrected. Victor Ashe told you the Reverend was angry about someone accessing his files. And Margaret Fenwick told us the Reverend didn't trust his son. He paused. What if the terrible mistake, the one being corrected, was not the confrontation with Ashe? What if it was something the Reverend did himself, months earlier, that set the circumstances in motion? I thought about that. He revoked Daniel's combination access, which might have spooked whoever was working with Daniel, or working through Daniel, into accelerating their plans. Or, Wolfe said, the Reverend did something worse. He confided in someone he should not have trusted. He told someone about the testament, its location, its contents, and that someone used the information. We sat with that for a moment. Sylvia Trent, I said. She is not excluded, Wolfe said carefully. Neither is Cross, nor Daniel Fenwick, who may have had the combination still, nor Margaret Fenwick herself, who was the one person the Reverend demonstrably did trust, which can be either innocence or very effective positioning. You suspect Margaret? I suspected everyone. That is the appropriate default, but Margaret Fenwick is the person who brought this case to me, which is either the act of an innocent woman seeking justice, or an unusually bold maneuver by someone who calculated that controlling the investigation is safer than evading it. I thought about the red dress and the old eyes, and the stillness of a spring waiting to uncoil. She didn't strike me as calculating. The people who strike you that way rarely are, Wolfe said. He reached for his beer. Tomorrow evening, bring them all back here. I believe I know the mechanism well enough to test the theory. And if you're wrong, He looked at me with the patient expression of a man who is not planning to be wrong. Then someone will have told an incriminating lie under controlled conditions, and we will start again from there. Chapter 7. The Test. Monday evening I called them all, and delivered the summons with a formula I've used before. Mr. Wolfe has reached certain conclusions, and requests your presence to share them. This is not optional. The subtext, be here or be implicated, is generally sufficient. I also made 3 other calls. The first was to Kramer at Homicide, which I make with the same reluctance I apply to dental appointments. Inspector Kramer and I have a relationship built on mutual usefulness and mutual irritation, which is actually quite a healthy foundation. I told him Wolfe believed the Fenwick death was a homicide and that there was material evidence, and that if he wanted the case, he should arrange for the body to be held pending a proper toxicology. He said things I won't repeat. But he made the call to the ME's office. The second call was to Dr. Marsh, who agreed to make himself available by telephone if needed. The third was to a locksmith Wolfe uses occasionally, a cheerful man named Prentice, who can open most things and discuss it clinically afterward. I asked him a specific technical question about combination safe change procedures, and whether a changed combination in the model installed at the foundation would leave a dated record in the lock mechanism. He said it would. I asked him to examine the safe. By the time the guests assembled at 8 o'clock, I had Prentice's report in my pocket. The safe combination had not been changed in 4 years. The revocation of Daniel Fenwick's access had been administrative paperwork over an unchanged lock. Daniel Fenwick could still open his father's safe. Wolfe knew this when they settled in. The seating arrangement was as before, except that this time I'd added a chair beside mine, for Prentice, who sat against the wall, with the unassuming air of a man who fixes things. Wolfe looked at them all. Daniel Fenwick with his practiced composure, Cross with his steady eyes, Trent with her professional armor, Margaret Fenwick with her stillness. I will lay out the facts, Wolfe said. You will interrupt only to correct a material error. There are no material errors, so I would prefer you did not interrupt. Reverend Charles Fenwick was murdered last Friday afternoon by means of digitalis poisoning introduced to his tea. The compound was derived from foxglove grown in the foundation's own garden, a preparation requiring several days of work, confirming premeditation. The Reverend was on atenolol for mild hypertension. A person aware of this medication knew the digitalis would act with particular speed and lethality, and would produce symptoms indistinguishable from cardiac arrest. The murder was preceded by the removal of the Crimson Testament from the Reverend's safe. That removal was facilitated by access to the safe combination. The combination had not been changed in 4 years, meaning Mr. Daniel Fenwick retained functional access, despite the administrative revocation of 8 months ago. Daniel Fenwick started to speak. Wolfe raised his finger. I said no interruptions. The tea was delivered early that afternoon because Mr. Cross, at the suggestion of another person, had moved his preparation schedule forward. The delivery that cleared the kitchen was scheduled from Mr. Cross's account. The question of who scheduled it is central. Wolfe looked at Cross. Mr. Cross, I will ask you directly and in this company. Did you schedule the printing delivery yourself? Cross looked steadily back. Yes, he said, but not on that date. I scheduled it 2 weeks earlier for a different delivery date. The date was changed afterward. I didn't change it. When did you discover it had been changed? Wolfe asked. Last night, Cross said, when Mr. Goodwin's questions made me go back and look. And the email log shows the change was made from within the Foundation system? Yes. Wolfe nodded, which brings us to access. The Foundation's shared office system logs all file access by username. Mr. Goodwin obtained those logs this afternoon. He looked at me. I had obtained them, with Kowalski's reluctant cooperation and a fax from Inspector Kramer. I read from my notebook. The delivery date modification was made from a terminal in the 3rd floor administrative suite. The session was logged under Cross's username. The timestamp is 2 weeks ago, a Thursday, at 6:48 in the evening. Building entry logs, Wolfe said. Who was in the building at 6:48 on that Thursday? I had those too. Cross had signed out at 6:15. Daniel Fenwick was logged in. He had a board prep meeting that ran until 8. Trent was logged in. She had a donor call at 7. Margaret Fenwick was not in the building. I paused. One other person. A visitor logged in at 6:30 under a guest pass. Victor Ashe. He signed out at 7:40. The room had gone very still. Victor Ashe, Wolfe said, visited the building 2 weeks before the murder, at the time when a change was made from Cross's terminal. He visited again 3 days before the murder, shaking the Reverend with a confrontation from which the Reverend emerged telling his assistant he'd made a terrible mistake. Wolfe paused. What was the terrible mistake? I believe the Reverend, under some pressure from Ashe, had told him, or confirmed for him, details about the testament. He later realized that information had been used against him, that the people around him were now aware of the testament's contents and location in ways they should not have been. Hence the increased security concern. Hence the decision to move the document from the safe. Sylvia Trent said quietly, You're saying Ashe orchestrated this? Ashe provided motivation and possibly information, Wolfe said. He is not, however, the person who prepared the digitalis, who knew the tea routine intimately, who had daily access to the kitchen and the garden, and who stood to benefit personally from the testament's disappearance. He looked directly at Trent. You filed an HR complaint against Daniel Fenwick 6 weeks ago for accessing private financial files. Files that documented your own arrangement with the Foundation, an arrangement that predated even Victor Ashe's. Trent's composure did not crack, but it changed texture. I don't know what you mean. The Crimson Testament documents 31 years of irregular payments to a subcontractor, consulting firm, that for the first 8 of those years was sole owned by a woman who shares your maiden name. He let that breathe. The Reverend knew. He chose to employ you anyway, perhaps because your work was excellent, or perhaps because the knowledge was itself useful to him. But Daniel Fenwick, accessing those files, would have found it. Hence your complaint, an attempt to close that avenue before he read far enough. This is, Trent began, the garden, Wolfe said without raising his voice. You oversee facilities operations as part of your development role. You assigned the groundskeeper to off-site work on the days leading to the murder. You had the garden largely to yourself. You have a background, I had Mr. Goodwin confirm this afternoon, in botanical science. You spent 2 years at Cornell's horticultural program before switching to development work. The silence that followed was of a different quality than any silence we'd had in that room before. You coordinated with Victor Ashe, Wolfe continued. He confirmed the testament's location. He provided the original impetus, the pressure that made the Reverend confide where the document was. You used Cross's terminal to move the delivery date. You prepared the compound over the preceding days and introduced it to the tea during the window you had created. You opened the safe using the combination you obtained, not from Cross, whose combination you correctly assessed would not help you, but from Daniel Fenwick, who still had the original, and who you correctly assessed resented his father enough to share it, either wittingly or in an unguarded moment. Daniel, I said. Everyone looked at him. He was pale. She asked me once, months ago, if the combination had ever been changed. I said I assumed not. I didn't. He stopped. I didn't give it to her. I told her I assumed it hadn't changed. Which was enough, Wolfe said. She could verify with a brief test of the lock. The empty strongbox was, I imagine, a significant surprise. Trent stood up. It was not a frightened gesture. It was, if anything, composed. This is an interesting construction, she said, but it's circumstantial. Yes, Wolfe said, for the moment. Inspector Kramer is currently overseeing a toxicology examination of the Reverend's remains. By tomorrow morning, there will be nothing circumstantial about the cause of death. the Foundation's server logs showing modification of the delivery schedule from a terminal you accessed are not circumstantial. The horticultural background is not circumstantial. The financial records in the testament, he placed his hand on the desk drawer, which I have here, and which document the 31 years of arrangements I mentioned, provide motive that is not circumstantial. Trent looked at the drawer. Her composure held for another 3 seconds. Then it didn't. She sat back down, and the room around her slowly exhaled. Chapter 8. The Full Account. Kramer came to the brownstone Tuesday morning with the toxicology results, which confirmed elevated digoxin levels consistent with acute poisoning, and with the expression of a man who has been proved wrong about something and is processing it through the medium of controlled irritation. He sat in the red leather chair that clients use and looked at Wolfe with the particular quality of attention that means he's listening, even though he'd prefer not to be. "Walk me through it," he said. Wolfe did. "I have been present at approximately 40 of these summaries over the years, and they never lose their quality." Wolfe speaks in complete paragraphs, each one leading to the next, with the inevitability of a well-constructed argument. And by the time he reaches the conclusion, the thing feels not merely solved, but obvious, as though the answer had been available to anyone paying the right kind of attention all along. This is, I've come to understand, both his gift and his method. He waits until the truth is complete before he speaks it, and when he speaks it, complete, it sounds inevitable. The full account went like this. Sylvia Trent had worked for the Foundation for 11 years. In that time, her extraordinary competence in development work had made her indispensable, and the Reverend, who was a man of genuine institutional intelligence, had valued her accordingly. But 11 years of close proximity to a man like Charles Fenwick had also meant 11 years of knowing where the bodies were buried, including her own. The consulting arrangement, a firm that had paid Trent's maiden name entity approximately $400,000 over 8 years for services the Foundation could not clearly document, predated her employment. She had, in essence, been a beneficiary of Foundation funds before becoming a Foundation employee. The Reverend had known. He had hired her anyway. Whether this reflected a genuine belief in her abilities, a strategy for keeping her close, or some combination, was a question the testament answered in the Reverend's characteristic oblique style. St. Knowledge secured. Arrangement concluded. Employed in good faith. File for record. When Daniel Fenwick had attempted to access the private financial records 6 weeks ago, Trent had moved quickly. The HR complaint was intended to close his access before he read far enough. The Reverend had cooperated. Partially. He withdrew the complaint, but told Trent, in terms she found alarming, that he was considering restructuring the private records. That he was, in his words, reevaluating certain long-standing arrangements. She had understood that to mean she was no longer protected. Victor Ashe had entered the picture through his own desperation. He had come to the building 2 weeks before the murder, seeking, as he told me, relief from the testament's record. He and Trent had encountered each other, and in that encounter had discovered a mutual interest. Ashe told her what he knew of the testament's location, the private safe in the study, and she used her access to Cross's unattended terminal to move the delivery date forward, creating the kitchen window. The preparation of the compound had taken the preceding 10 days. A foxglove, which Trent as facilities overseer could access freely, provided the raw material. Her Cornell background gave her the knowledge. The Reverend's atenolol prescription, which she had encountered in the Foundation's health insurance records during an administrative audit 2 years prior, gave her the confidence that the dose would be effective. On the afternoon of the murder, she had 5 minutes. It was enough. The empty strongbox had been, as Wolfe had predicted, a significant shock. She had taken it, locked it in her own office, expecting its contents, and opened it that evening to find it empty. The subsequent days had been spent in controlled panic, maintaining composure in public, searching privately, and trying to determine whether the Reverend had moved the document or whether someone else had reached it first. She had not, it emerged, considered the reading chair. Kramer had taken Trent into custody Sunday night, following Wolfe's Monday evening session. She had retained counsel within the hour, and said nothing further. Victor Ashe was being sought for questioning regarding his role in the planning stages. "The document itself," Kramer said, "will be turned over to you," Wolfe said, "after I have satisfied myself regarding its relevance to the active investigation. The contents are extensive. Many of the figures named in it are no longer living. Those who are will require careful handling." Kramer looked at him. "I'll be wanting that document today, Wolfe." "You will have it this afternoon, with a summary I have prepared of the relevant entries. There is nothing in it that benefits from dramatic disclosure." Kramer left with the understanding, which is not the same thing as an agreement, that the testament would arrive at his office by 3. I drove it over myself, in an envelope sealed with Wolfe's personal wax, a touch that Kramer would either appreciate or find insufferable, and which Wolfe had insisted upon regardless. Margaret Fenwick came by that afternoon, after I called her with the news. She sat in the red chair and listened to the summary with the stillness I'd noticed at our first meeting, and when I finished she was quiet for a moment. "She was with us for 11 years, she said. "Yes, and she killed him for a financial record. For what the financial record could do to her, which amounts to the same thing." She looked at the desk where Wolfe had replaced his book, The Decline and Fall again, and was reading with the focused peace of a man whose professional obligations have been satisfied. "Thank you," she said, to Wolfe. Wolfe looked up. "Your father-in-law was a man who used knowledge as a form of control," he said. "That strategy has a predictable endpoint. I do not say this to diminish his death, which is a matter for justice. I say it because it is the truth, and you appear to be a woman who benefits from the truth." She looked at him for a moment. "He wasn't a bad man." "No. Bad men rarely build institutions that last 40 years. They are, however, frequently men who believe that carrying other people's secrets is the same as bearing responsibility for them." He returned to his book. "It is not." She left quietly. Daniel Fenwick would have a great deal to reckon with. The HR complaint, his father's distrust, his unwitting provision of safe combination information to a murderer. None of it rose to criminal culpability, but it would be a hard winter. I didn't feel entirely sorry for him. I didn't feel entirely unsympathetic either. He was a man who had wanted his father's power without his father's patience, and had spent 6 years learning, the hard way, why those things are not separable. That evening, Fritz made a beef bourguignon that would have reformed a cynic, and Wolfe ate 2 portions, and drank a bottle of Montrachet that he'd been saving for an occasion he deemed worthy. I had beer, and the satisfaction of a week's work that had turned out to mean something. "The reading chair," I said after dinner. "You knew he'd moved it, before I searched." "I suspected he'd moved it," Wolfe said. "A man who has maintained a document for 40 years does not lose it. He moves it when threatened. The question was whether he'd had time to move it far, and whether whoever killed him had thought to look in the obvious places. The chair wasn't obvious. It was obvious to a man who reads." He set his glass down. The Reverend was a reader. A reader, under threat, goes to his reading chair. It is where one goes to think. A pause. I would have gone to mine. I looked at Wolfe's chair, the reinforced custom edifice behind the desk, and did not say what I was thinking, which was that you could hide a medium-sized library in the base of that thing, and nobody would ever know. Some thoughts are better kept. "Next case," I said. "There is no next case," he said. "There is a man in Albuquerque whose neighbor is poisoning his roses. You read that letter? You left it on the desk. I am not incurious." He opened his book. "Write him. A referral to a competent local botanist should suffice. We do not do roses. We do dead theologians and 40-year-old secrets. We do whatever presents itself with sufficient intellectual interest." He found his page. "The roses, I am confident, will not." I went to my desk and wrote the letter. Outside, New York was doing what New York does in late October. Getting dark early, moving fast, keeping its secrets close. Somewhere in the city, a red-leather journal was being read by police inspectors and lawyers with varying degrees of alarm and recognition. Somewhere, Sylvia Trent was talking to her counsel. Somewhere, 40 years of institutional memory was being slowly, carefully, officially unraveled. In the brownstone on West 35th Street, Wolfe read. Fritz hummed something in the kitchen. I finished the letter, sealed the envelope, and put it in the outbox. It had been, as I predicted on that first Tuesday, with the autumn rain and the woman in the red dress, an interesting week. The Crimson Testament was closed. The city kept its appointments, and in the plant rooms above us, 1,400 orchids bloomed in complete indifference to human affairs, which is the most sensible attitude available, and one I occasionally envy.